What if I told you your brain is built to protect you from discomfort, even if that means sabotaging your own progress without you even knowing? Hey everyone, Elias Abid here, and today we're going to talk about something that's fundamentally changed how I see everything in my life: systems thinking. Here's the thing: your brain is literally working against you right now. Evolution has shaped our minds to see the world in simplified linear ways. Event A causes outcome B. Do this, get that. It's how we've evolved over thousands of years. But this simplified thinking approach is failing us in our complex modern world. Think about the last time you tried to make a significant change in your life. Maybe it was a new fitness routine, a new study habit, or just breaking a bad habit in general. And now let me ask you this: did it stick? Or did it just mysteriously, magically fall apart after a few weeks despite your best intentions? And that failure wasn't because you lack willpower or discipline. It happened because you were trying to change a part without understanding the whole system. You were essentially playing chess while only looking at one piece. Systems thinking is what allows us to see the entire board, the hidden connections, the feedback loops, and the patterns that determine whether our efforts succeed or fail. But here's the paradox: even though systems thinking is incredibly powerful, our brains naturally reject it, naturally resist it. We have cognitive blind spots, so to say, that make it difficult, that make it hard to see these systems even when they're right in front of us. So, in this video, we're going to cover why your brain naturally rejects systems thinking, the specific cognitive biases that block your perception, practical techniques to overcome these limitations, and how developing your systems intelligence can transform your approach to relationships, problems, and goals. So whether you're struggling with complex decisions, trying to build better habits, or you're just feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges themselves, understanding systems thinking might be the mental upgrade you've been missing. So let's get into it. Let me tell you about Alex, a student who kept hitting the same wall. Every semester, Alex would start with amazing intentions: perfect organization system, study schedule, workout routine, and nutrition plan. But then, by week 3, the entire system would collapse. Alex would blame willpower or time management, and maybe even the specific productivity app he uses. But what Alex couldn't see was that he was dealing with a system, not isolated habits. Each element was connected to everything else that weren't immediately obvious. But this is the first and major reason our brains reject systems thinking, because we evolved for simplicity. For most of human history, we dealt with direct observable causes and effects. If you saw a predator, you ran. If you were hungry, you found food. The ability to make quick linear connections was a survival advantage. But today's problems are different. They involve complex interconnections, delayed effects, and non-linear relationships. And our brains haven't had time to adapt and evolve for this complexity. I'm sure you've seen variations of this, but there is a pretty interesting concept introduced by Sir Isaac Newton that describes this very well. He introduced multiple of those laws, as we might call it, but we want to focus on the first one for now. His first law of motion states: an object at rest remains at rest, and an object in motion remains in motion at constant speed and in a straight line unless acted on by an unbalanced force. And another law that you might be familiar with is his law of cause and effect, which already suggests that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. That for everything you input into the world, you will receive an equal and opposite output. And now you might ask yourself, okay, cool, but what does any of that have to do with systems thinking and finding clarity? Let me tell you. For us here on this channel, it is of high importance that we cover and we talk about first principles. And now you might ask yourself, why is that? We use first principles to base our reasoning on them. We want to have a form of foundation for our decision making, and that is why we use first principles. We will go over this in a minute when we talk about how a system actually works and how it is built. But what you need to understand for now is that everything in your life operates on this law that we just talked about, therefore being a system. And let me draw this out for you so that you can understand this better. If you've watched any of my previous videos on identity and union psychology, you'll know that I like to think of our willpower as this battery that every one of us has that gets depleted over the day. And we can apply this same thinking to our energy and attention. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of people say that where your attention goes, energy flows. And the difference now is that we don't look at it from a motivational standpoint, but from a critically questioning one, with a question in mind, is there actually some truth to it? And don't worry, we'll get into the actionable steps and the interesting stuff in a minute. But if you don't at least try to understand this basic concept I'm about to share with you, you might as well leave the video now. Alright, so think of your energy and attention as this battery. Beautiful battery. Energy and attention is very closely linked, as you'll see in a second. And now from the moment you wake up in the morning, where is your attention going? Where is your attention going from the first thing that you do in the morning? Is it negative thoughts about the past, fearful thoughts about the uncertainty of your future, or is your attention in the present moment on your body and the goals you want to achieve that day? And I can imagine that the first thing that a lot of people do is grabbing their phone, checking for notifications, or jumping straight into social media, letting the algorithm dictate in their emotional state due to the media which is being consumed. And I'm not perfect by any means, far from it actually, but I avoid even going into those states of mind by just planning the whole day out the night before, so that my emotions don't even have a chance in convincing me otherwise that morning. When we look at highly successful people from the past or even the present, they disagreed about a lot of things, but the one thing they all agreed upon is this: we become what we think about. Oh yeah, manifesting your dream life by just thinking about it and telling yourself all those fancy affirmations will make you successful. No, that's not what I mean. I heard this the first time while listening to an audio program of Earl Nightingale called The Strangest Secret, in which he goes into detail about this concept. I highly recommend it if you ever wondered why it seems that only 1% of people actually manage to be successful in this life. And as I said before, I like to clearly define terms first before actually using them and just throwing them around without having a clearly defined definition, without having a clear definition first. That's what I wanted to say. This happens a lot when we try to teach someone something, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And you know, sometimes I just find it challenging, just as you saw, connecting all the dots of my thoughts and the information in my head in a clear, concise, and practical way so that it makes sense to anyone watching this, and it makes sense to myself. But this is just a skill issue which could be solved by developing systems intelligence, as we will cover in a minute. Okay, back to what I was saying earlier. We want to define the terms we use first so that we can communicate clearly and base our decision making on the same foundational understanding. First of all, let's define success. And again, there are no right or wrong answers here. But what does success sound like to you? What does success mean to you? And Luc Belmar, for those of you who know, refers to this concept as the symphony of success. What does success sound like to you? But the best definition I could agree on, and which Earl Nightingale suggests, is success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. So what that means is that as long as you have a clearly self-defined goal that you're working towards, you're considered successful. Okay, I believe you get the point of this great exercise. Now let's keep on moving. At the beginning of this section, I suggested that we look at our attention and our energy as this battery that is fully charged up in the morning, and we have all this capacity. And one very interesting concept I've seen countless other successful people like Dan Henry, Charlie Morgan, or Sam Ovens talk about is this. Instead of looking at our energy and attention as this battery that we just talked about, we can look at it as a ball. Alright, I even have a better way to illustrate this. We have our limited attention and energy in a day, which is represented by this cup right here. And this cup is filled with water. And this water represents our potential input for the day. So this potential input is what you could do in the day if all the circumstances were perfect and the environmental encouragements would push you to do the things that need to be done. But now what happens when we do things and we invest energy into things that have nothing to do with our vision and the goals which that vision encompasses is that we penetrate this wall. We penetrate the wall of this cup at little points like here and here. And we penetrate this cup and water or potential input is flowing out of this cup. So we essentially create holes where the water or the potential input drips out. A negative return on investment because it does not help us in any possible way. But then there are also the investments that we make of energy and attention that we make in a day that actually moves us closer to our self-defined goals. And those investments, if spent on the right lever-moving actions or in the tasks, are obviously positive in return. And this water, which are the positive impact, positive inputs, stays in the cup. And this water stays in the cup until the moment of adding up all of the daily investments that you made at the end of each day. Because what happens at the end of each day is this. All of our investments that are added up and filled into this faucet right here. Let's see if I can draw a faucet. Wow, beautiful. So all of our inputs, our investments essentially, are put and filled into this faucet. And this water is filled into this small little tub. And all the investments after being added up flow or drip into this bowl. And this bowl represents your daily results. I hope you get the point I'm trying to make here, but what this essentially means is the simple fact that focused attention and focused energy is times more effective than scattered and fragmented attention. Well, I could have just used the example with the magnifying glass and the sun, right? I'm sure you know this. The magnifying glass and the sun, focused sun energy being focused by the magnifying glass is way more powerful and can create a fire, and just sunlight as itself, by itself, can't create fire when hit in the ground, right? Just for you to understand the model which Charlie Morgan, Dan Henry, and Sam Ovens used, I'll draw this up real quick for you. So they essentially said that our energy and attention over the day is this circle. This is the 100%. You wake up in the morning and you have 100% of your potential inputs, as we just called it. And every single thing that we invest energy into, and attention, as we just said, energy, energy. Energy is synonymous with attention right here because they're very closely linked. And as we just said with the quote that is very popular, where your attention goes, energy flows. So this ball right here, this circle, represents our 100% of potential energy and attention, which can be invested into the things we do over the day. And what Charlie Morgan, Sam Ovens, and other successful people suggested now is that every single thing we invest energy into, like be it starting a new side hustle, or I want to build a digital product because Iman said so, or I want to start a podcast, I want to start a new business, I want to start a clothing brand, I want to watch YouTube, the educational content, or I want to go out with friends, I want to party. All these investments of energy and attention grab percentages of this 100% that you wake up in the morning, that you wake up with in the morning. And this essentially arrives at the same conclusion that the more arrows and the more investments you make over the day, be it positive or negative, you cannot improve or you cannot create progress and momentum with any of them if you invest, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10% for each of them. And every day, 10%, you invest 10% of your 100% energy into one of those areas, one of those investments. And you will never build momentum this way. Let's say you only had two things that you invest your energy into, two big projects. And those big projects, if you do it the right way, could potentially get 50% of your energy and attention over the day. And now imagine how much more progress you can make, how much more momentum you can build, more momentum you can build if you invest so much more, this much more energy. You get the point. Focused attention, more progress. Scattered attention, fragmented attention, less progress, no momentum. You get the point. So focusing and trying to build, I could actually just leave that there. So trying to build and trying to focus on too many things at once must result in none of them succeeding and picking up momentum to grow, as I just talked about. This might have been just me trying to order my thoughts and deepen my understanding of this concept by illustrating this multiple ways and trying to explain it the most practical and easiest way. But let's see if I did a good job. So I believe you could follow me until here. And with all of this said, and with all of the fundamental understanding I told you we'd need, let's go over the three specific biases that block systems perception. First, there's what's called the immediacy bias. Our attention and our energy is naturally drawn to things and drawn to events that's happening right now, right in front of us. And we struggle to connect events that are separated by time or space. Think about climate change, for example. The cause, carbon emissions, and the effect, the rise in temperatures, are separated by decades. And our brains don't actually connect these dots. We're wired for immediate feedback. And the same goes for building muscles, for example, in the gym or in your business success. At first, nothing happens, then everything happens. The second bias is our reductionist tendency. And what is the reductionist tendency? The reductionist tendency is that we instinctively break things down into smaller parts to understand them more clearly. And this works brilliantly for certain scientific discoveries, but falls apart when dealing with complex systems where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And look at how we approach health, for example. We focus on isolated metrics like calories or specific nutrients rather than seeing the interconnected systems of sleep, stress, movement, nutrition, and relationships in general. The third bias is our control illusion. What is the control illusion? The control illusion essentially is that we overestimate our ability to control direct outcomes and underestimate the role of the systems around us. And this is why so many of the New Year's resolutions fail. We believe that sheer willpower will overcome the systems that we are embedded in currently. And we try to force change without understanding the feedback loops that maintain the current equilibrium. And as the systems thinker Donella Meadows wrote, we can't control systems or figure them out, but we can dance with them. As I've been exploring these different concepts, I've come across something very fascinating called the bathtub theorem. And what is the bathtub theorem? The bathtub theorem is a tongue twister. The bathtub theorem is a concept that's really changed how I think about problems in general, and I think it might do the same for you. Now, let's talk about this bathtub theorem. And don't worry, this isn't some complex mathematical proof. It's actually a surprisingly simple mental model that can help us understand virtually any system. And I think it perfectly illustrates why systems thinking might be more valuable than just setting goals alone. And now we want to go over understanding this concept. First, I want you to imagine a bathtub. Let's see if I can draw a bathtub. With the low legs. Oh my god. Horrific. The water flows in. Let's see if I can draw this again. The water flows in from this faucet right here. This isn't some art class. Well, that's good enough. So, the water comes in from the faucet and leaves from the drain right here. And these two flows, the inflow from the faucet and the outflow from the drain, they determine how much water stays in the tub at any given moment. If more water flows in than leaves through the drain, obviously the water level will rise. If more water leaves the bathtub, then water is coming in and it flows into the bathtub. Obviously, the water level is gonna sink, decrease. How do you say that? The water level is gonna decrease. Sounds good. And now the question arises is what happens when the inflow exactly matches the outflow. So there is an equilibrium, there is balance. The inflow exactly matches the outflow. And now what happens? And the answer to that is pretty obvious. The water level is gonna stay stable. More water in, it's obvious. I don't need to explain this. More water in, less water out, water levels rising. More water out, less water in, water level is sinking. And this ridiculously simple concept seems to be the key to understanding everything from your bank accounts to climate change to anything else. And it might be one of those mental concepts that separates conventional thinking from systems thinking. And take finances, for example. Money flows into your account in form of an income and leaves your account in form of expenses, any form of expenses, right? But to build sustained wealth, you need more flowing in than out, obviously. And if you're losing money each month, that just means that you're draining your tub faster than you're filling. And connected to that very concept, I've been thinking about my own media consumption lately. Time spent scrolling social media or binge watching value-packed content that was supposed to be educational content, which represents the outflow. And then on the other side, the inflow, connected to that example, the inflow was actual time spent creating value or doing meaningful work. And that represents the inflow. The outflow is consumption. That's how we can say it. Consumption and creation. And what I've come to realize is that it seems like building a fulfilling life, the good life, requires more time creating than consuming. Well, obviously. Otherwise, we're just emptying our tub of potential without refilling it. And climate change works the exact same way. Carbon enters the atmosphere through emissions and exits through processes like photosynthesis. But don't even remind me of biology, please, bro. When emissions exceed what nature can absorb, obviously, carbon accumulates in the atmosphere. And it's like the same thing we just talked about, the bathtub. Carbon comes in, natural processes like photosynthesis try to absorb this carbon, and if the carbon exceeds the limit that natural processes like for the photosynthesis can absorb, then the bathtub is going to fill up and potentially overspill if it's being overfilled. And this is why setting goals like I'll reduce my social media time by 30% sounds good at first, but misses the point entirely. If you're still consuming more than you're creating, your personal growth bathtub in this example isn't growing, it continues to drain. The only difference is that if you say that 30% less, you're not stopping the potential from draining. You're just minimally slowing down the draining process. And what we can take from that is that what matters is the balance between consumption and creation, not just cutting back on one side, not just cutting back on the consumption side and not improving your creation. And the bathtub theorem might explain why many of our ambitious goals don't lead to lasting change. Like, for example, these New Year's resolutions that always fail after a couple of weeks. Because those ambitious goals often focus on changing the rate of draining the bathtub instead of understanding the entire system. And what I'm learning is that meaningful change might require the flows, not just adjusting one side of the equation. And I don't need to explain this again, but the equation is creation minus consumption equals I don't want to say water levels, but essentially it is the water level. The water level of your metaphorical bathtub. And this perfectly relates to what we explored earlier about the mental models. When we're operating with a limited mental model, we're like focusing solely on the goal side of the equation, or solely focusing on the consumption or creation side of the equation, without including all the factors involved in this whole system. We might be playing a game we can't win, or we're creating a system that's destined to lose or destined to fail. But when we shift to systems thinking, when we shift to a systems thinking lens, we can start to see different levers that might actually be the controlling factors that control the outcomes, that we can essentially try to, like, how do I explain this? We have the inflow, the creation, and the outflow, the consumption. If we only focus on one side of the equation, we will fail. We will build a system that is destined to fail. There's no other way. We can't win with the system in the metaphorical game if we start with only focusing on one side of the equation. We understand this for now. But so the only thing that we can focus on is the inputs. That's clear by now. But by figuring out what the levers are, because there are levers, for example, the 80-20 rule. 20% of the inputs create 80% of the outputs. So if we figure out what this 20% of the inputs is, that brings us 80% of the outputs, and we solely focus on these inputs, it is very likely that we can indirectly influence the output. This is what I wanted to say. I hope you get my point right now. So next time you're facing a problem, maybe try something different. Instead of just setting a goal vaguely, ask yourself, what's flowing in? What's flowing out? And how might you adjust these flows to get the results you want? And I think this could be related to the second order thinking concept we will cover in a minute. But while most people focus on surface level goals, there's possibly more value in operating at a deeper level, which is trying to understand and work with the systems that actually determine outcomes. And the systems that actually determine outcomes are the 20% of inputs that create 80% of outputs, the levers. The levers or the lever moving actions. Now let's revisit Alex for a moment. When Alex finally approached the problem he had through a systems lens, everything changed. Instead of treating each habit as isolated, he mapped the connections between sleep, study focus, exercise, nutrition, and social obligations. And this revealed feedback loops that weren't obvious before. For example, late night studying was disrupting his sleep, which reduced his exercise motivation, which affected his mood and focus, which then made studying take longer, creating a vicious cycle. So the question we want to ask ourselves now is, what exactly is systems thinking? At its core, it's seeing the world as a collection of interconnected systems that form coherent patterns. It's understanding that changing one element affects everything else, often in ways that we can't see at first. So, the fundamental difference between linear and systems thinking is the difference between linear causality and circular causality. Linear thinking sees a straight line. A causes B, which causes C. This is essentially the linear thinking framework. But systems thinking is entirely different. Systems thinking sees loops, it sees networks. A, in this case, influences B, but B also influences A, and together creating C, which then A, B, and C could together create D, which none of them could create alone. I know this might sound a bit complex, but this is just, okay, I see a predator, I need to run until, otherwise I die. This sees, if I sleep bad, then I can't hunt, is an example of very primal example, right? If I sleep bad, then my hunting is gonna be bad. So if my hunting is gonna be bad, my family can't eat, and sleep, bad hunting, bad sleep, bad hunting, and A hungry family creates D, stress in the family, or whatever, right? And this is a circular causality. As we've talked about, linear causality, circular causality. And now you might think, okay, well, but where are all these systems? You talk about, oh, these systems are everywhere, they are everywhere around us. Give me examples, Elias. Okay, I will give you examples. As I told you, these systems are all around us. Your friend group is a system with its own dynamics and patterns. Your body, your own entire body, is a complex adaptive system. Your school or workplace is a system with formal and informal rules. Your habits form a self-reinforcing system. Even your thoughts and emotions function as a system. The language you speak, the money you work for, everything is a system. You get the point, and I hope I can do a good enough job in making you aware of the fact that everything around us is a system. Throughout history, the most innovative thinkers were often natural systems thinkers. Marcus Aurelius, for example, understood how thoughts, emotions, and actions formed interconnected webs. Leonardo da Vinci, he saw patterns connecting art, anatomy, and engineering. And the common quality they both possessed and the ability they both developed was to see what others missed, the interconnections, the patterns, and the feedback loops, the whole rather than just the parts. And before we go deep into systems thinking itself, I believe it is pretty smart to understand how a system even works. And you might be surprised, but it's actually not as complex or difficult to understand as someone might think at first. So let's get into it. So we have inputs over here, we have this triangle in the middle, which is the processes or the process, and we have outputs. And these two things we'll cover in a minute, but first things first, what is the inputs? The inputs is what you put in every single day. What is it that you input? Input in form of energy, attention. What is it that you invest your energy and attention into? The processes most likely is what you input these energies and attention into. What the process essentially is what you do with those inputs. What do you do with those inputs? How do you combine these inputs to create something of value? And what you create of value is most likely the output. And that's basically all a system is. But now, if that's all the system is, what is this little green box here and this little green box here? What is this green sun in the top right corner? Let me tell you. The sun in the top right corner is the environment. Oops. And the green box right here, down below, is the feedback. You see, even though a system could technically operate as we just covered, we all know that it's not free from influences and doesn't operate in a vacuum. The sun that you can see here is the environment, and the green box down here is the feedback, as I just told you. And we all know that humans are heavily influenced by, one, our environment, and two, our feedback, be it through social gatherings or through feedback in general. So not only our behavior is influenced by our environment, but also our emotional states are heavily affected by our environment. And then we have the feedback down here, which essentially means that the inputs influence again. That essentially means that the outputs influence the inputs, but it's the same way around, vice versa. Inputs affect outputs, outputs affect inputs. That's what I told you in the beginning of the video. The whole system, if you change only one element, one factor involved in this whole system, it affects everything else in ways we can't see at first. And that's what I meant when I said that. Outputs influence inputs, and inputs affect outputs through a feedback mechanism and feedback loops. And where I'm getting at with this is that all of this stuff is interconnected. Every element of the system, every factor involved affects every other factor, affects every other element in ways we can't see at first, in ways that might have delayed effects that we can't see in the first second. And usually, when we receive feedback in any form of information that we can perceive, we reorient, we refocus our actions, which is the inputs for the system, our actions. It's the other way to describe this. I could have just said inputs as actions, and this is the reactions. And those inputs, those actions are either towards a self-defined goal or towards the goal of survival, which then means pain aversion, because we all know that the fundamental goal of survival is pain aversion, avoiding pain, be it psychological or physical. And as we learned from Maxwell Maltz, humans are goal-striving beings, and our mind is the automatic course-correcting mechanism which operates purely on information. And what is this information? Information in the form of feedback. Feedback, you can think of feedback as anything that you can perceive with your senses. I'm referring to the masterpiece Psycho-Cybernetics here, by the way. And this relationship between inputs, outputs, processes, and feedback under the influence of the environment is what we call a feedback loop, and which can go either way. It can go in a positive way, in an upward spiral, or in a negative way, in a downward spiral, creating momentum in either way. It's like a flywheel. I remembered the exact moment I realized how blind I'd been to the systems operating in my own life. I was struggling with procrastination and always blaming myself for lacking discipline. But when I finally mapped out all the factors involved, I saw that my environment, digital and physical, sleep schedule, and even my nutrition were all creating a system that made procrastination almost inevitable. And it wasn't necessarily a character flaw, it was a system designed to fail. And once I could see the system, I could redesign it. So the question we want to ask ourselves now is, why is it that we miss these connections? And to answer this question, let's go over the brain-specific blind spots. First, the availability heuristic. What is the availability heuristic? The availability heuristic explains that our brains give greater weight to what's easily retrievable from memory. For example, we notice dramatic events but miss slow gradual changes and distant connections. And this is why we might instantly connect a late night to feeling tired the next day, but completely miss how our phone use at dinner affects our sleep hours later. And the second thing I want to talk to you about is that our education system trains us in reductionism, not holism. And holism, I've talked about this concept of holism many times in previous videos, but from elementary school, we're taught subjects in isolation. Math is separate from history, and history is separate from biology. And we rarely learn to see the connections between these fields. Even our language shapes and limits our ability to think in systems. Notice how we say things like, "she made me angry," rather than recognizing emotional triggers as a part of a system. I need to force myself to study, instead of designing a system that makes studying natural. That caused this, rather than seeing multiple contributing factors. Our very vocabulary predisposes us to linear, not systems thinking. And in today's attention economy, systems thinking faces its greatest threat yet. Our digital environment is specifically engineered to capture immediate attention, train us for distraction, and to fragment our thinking. But systems thinking requires sustained attention, the ability to hold multiple variables in mind, and comfort with complexity, which is precisely the mental muscles that modern media tries to weaken. And as author Neil Postman warned decades ago, we're being entertained into ignorance. Today we might say we're being optimized into simplistic thinking. And when I say that our minds love simplicity and try to avoid complexity, I want to give you a simple to understand example to drive this point home. What if I told you to put on your shoes, tie the laces, while counting from 0 to 20? You'd most likely think to yourself, well, that is incredibly simple and easy to do, hopefully. But what if I told you to build a multi-million-dollar company? You'd be overwhelmed because you would think achieving or building that must be so incredibly complex and hard to do that you aren't qualified for it. And let's even take a more realistic example of you making a consistent monthly income of $10,000 to $15,000 a month with an online business, like providing a high-value service to other businesses, for example. You'd think that, oh, this must be so incredibly complex, all those different skills I need to learn, all the rejection I need to face, all the failures and all the work concerning cold outreach, building my personal brand, I couldn't do it. And what we do when we express such excuses is that we just make things seem harder than they really are, not realizing that we only do so to make us feel better about ourselves. Because if it really was as simple as everyone says, but you still didn't do it, you'd look real stupid. And we want to avoid this pain of looking like a fool at all costs. So the next time someone presents a way of thinking or a way of life to you that is outside of your current beliefs, outside of your current belief system, notice how your brain naturally tries to avoid and reject this belief system or way of seeing life, categorize it as either a scam or something outside of your reach, and then really ask yourself if this belief serves you or only holds you back from achieving more. We've been talking about this concept multiple times in previous videos, but I cannot stress it enough because it is the single reason, it is the most important thing, the single reason we do almost anything in our lives. This one concept that I'm referring to explains why most New Year's resolutions fail after 3 weeks, why new habits that we want to adopt perish, and why our mind becomes overwhelmed and drifts into a state of anxiousness. And the one concept that I'm referring to here is known as the concept of entropy and centropy. First of all, for those of you who don't know, entropy, for what we're concerned with in the context of systems thinking, is the gradual decline into chaos, uncertainty, and disorder. Think anxiety, overwhelm, and that inescapable bubble of thoughts that only seems to get worse and worse because we can't make sense of the world and we don't have a clear hierarchy of goals that provide a frame or a structure to our mind. And connected to that is the all too well known neurotransmitter called dopamine. And as we all know, short-term gratification or cheap dopamine leads to entropy. But on the other side, there's also a concept known as centropy. And this will all make sense in a second when we have the perspective and the understanding of those two concepts. Bear with me. And when we talk about centropy or reversing entropy, we can think of it as the uphill battle that we all face as humans. It is maintaining, creating, or improving order and certainty. What we need to understand here, which took me years to grasp, and I still don't fully understand deeply, is that by doing nothing with your life, you deliberately choose to drown in chaos. And the false belief that most of us have is that when we do nothing with our life, we don't stay the same. The false belief that we have is when we do nothing, we stay the same. But that's exactly what we are mistaken. We don't stay the same when we do nothing with our lives. We dig ourselves into a hole when we don't try. We choose to dig ourselves into this hole because the life we want, the life we can be proud of, demands consistent effort towards our own goals, towards our own self-defined goals. So without getting too messy here with how we go about understanding and applying these concepts, entropy is the measure of how disordered something is. Connected to that, the German physicist Rudolf Clausius and the Scottish physicist William Thomson introduced the second law of thermodynamics, which, viewed through the lens of systems thinking, states that in any natural process, the total entropy, or disorder, tends to increase over time unless effort or energy is put into keeping the system ordered. I just wanted to cover this concept here because I really believe that this is the single reason we do almost anything. We try to maintain order and therefore avoiding chaos by investing energy, which is equal to attention or time here, into systems that, to one, make them more efficient, and two, to avoid them going into a state of chaos or disorder. I believe you get the point. So let's move on to the more practical part of this whole conversation. Now let's talk about seeing the real consequences of our actions and developing the skill of systems intelligence. And I want you to remember that this doesn't happen overnight. I still consider myself as an amateur in this field. I'm not an expert, far from it actually. Systems intelligence is a skill you build through deliberate practice. So here are exercises, practical exercises to develop your systems perception, your systems intelligence. First, connection mapping. Take any problem that you have and at least try to figure out 10 factors that influence it. And then draw the connections between these factors and ask yourself which ones reinforce each other, which create feedback loops. And this simple exercise begins training your brain to see relationships rather than isolated factors, because we want to see the interconnected nature of the world and the interconnected nature of systems itself. And this is what we talked about earlier on the example with Alex, and how his sleep schedule influenced every other area of his life, possibly limiting his performance. Next, and this might be my favorite one actually, is second order questioning. What is second order questioning and why is it my favorite one out of all of these? This practice is that for any action or decision that you want to make, ask yourself, and then what happens? And what might that lead to? And force yourself to think 2 or 3 steps ahead, the consequences of your actions, but multiplied by 2 or 3 times. For example, if you're considering a new study schedule, ask, how will this affect my sleep? How will those sleep changes affect my exercise habits? How will those exercise changes affect my mood? And how will that mood change circle back to affect my studying? Third is delay recognition. Train your delay recognition. What do I mean by this? When I say that you need to train your delay recognition, I mean start noticing patterns where cause and effect are separated by time. And how I do this is I keep a journal with me wherever I go, and in this journal is where I track my actions and their delayed results. So, as we just talked about, we have cause and effect. We have cause and effect, and linear causality and linear thinking suggests that cause A is directly related to cause B, and B cannot influence A because B is linked to C, and B is the cause for this effect, and A is the single and sole cause of this effect. But this is not what we want to focus on. We want to focus on systems thinking. And systems thinking suggests that cause A can create cause B, but for A and B to create C, for example, there can be time that elapses between cause and effect that isn't effect didn't even see that, cause and effect, that time elapses that we can't see at first, in the first moment, when taking actions that create the cause. And finally, I want to give you the daily exercises, the daily practical exercises that I currently do to develop the skill of systems intelligence, to develop the skill of systems perception. And one thing that I highly recommend to everyone is reading across diverse fields rather than narrowing your knowledge in one specific field. So, if you want to learn marketing, or if you want to learn copywriting, for example, read psychology, read philosophy, read marketing materials, read sales, read all these. We talked about this. They are interconnected systems. Everything affects everything else. So if you read psychology, for example, everything, all that a skill is just a culmination of different techniques, and these techniques can be studied through psychology, marketing, business, philosophy, all these different fields and disciplines. The next thing I would recommend is scheduling regular zooming out time to see the bigger picture of your project and goals. And zooming out is just to take the perspective of, for example, a how do you say that? Third person's point of view, I guess. And just seeing yourself from a higher perspective, right? Seeing the actions you take, seeing the projects you work on from a higher perspective to evaluate your current actions and your current inputs that create the outputs through your process, right? Now, we all know that developing systems intelligence isn't always easy. So let's address the common obstacles you will probably face. This is a big one. Impatience with long-term thinking. Impatience with long-term thinking in the context of systems thinking is that systems often have delayed responses, as we just talked about with the cause and effect relationship. And when we make changes to a system, you might not see the effects for days, weeks, or even months. And the solution to that is to create shorter feedback loops to bridge the gap. So use, for example, tracking and measurement devices or techniques to give yourself earlier signals that your system's changes are working. So if you have your KPIs, your key performance indicators that we talked about are the lever moving actions, you can create feedback loops. That means feedback loop is input, process, output, and therefore creating feedback in the form of feedback. What? Oh, bro. So feedback in the form of information that you can perceive through your senses, which influences your input, then going the circle, in the cycle creating the outputs, which then give you more feedback to refine your inputs, and then creating a feedback loop. So you can essentially create shorter feedback loops when you have measuring devices and measuring, how do you say this, point sticks, where you say, okay, I'll reach this, my inputs were that, so I can measure this and see it as a feedback loop. I just illustrated it way more complex than it actually is. I hope you get the point now, but I could have explained this way easier and in simpler terms. But you know, my audience is very smart and they will understand my cripply drawings. And that's also a big one, complexity overwhelm. Because after watching this video, I don't know how long it is, 30, 40 minutes. After watching this video and seeing all the interconnections and understanding how a system even works, and understanding that the fact that everything around you is a system, and all the things you do, all the actions you take in the day are because of a system that you want to maintain the order in, it can feel paralyzing, and there seem to be too many variables to manage. And this is the exact point. The solution is to focus on those leverage points we talked about earlier, the KPIs, the 20% of inputs that create 80% of the results, and focusing on those rather than trying to control every other element. And in any system, some connections matter more than others. And if I were you, I would start mapping the entire system, then identify these 20% of factors that drive 80% of the results, and then just go with the flow and see where my inputs and outputs will end up. And before you see me as some kind of expert in this 20-80-20 rule, I still struggle heavily with the identification of these KPIs, the key lever moving actions myself, but mapping the whole system to see which elements are the actual drivers for the results helps immensely. So remember that systems intelligence develops gradually. It doesn't happen overnight. Your first attempt at mapping systems will be very messy, and that's very normal. The neural pathways for systems thinking will grow, will strengthen over time with practice. It's like every other thing you want to start. It grows and develops with practice. So here's what we've covered today. Our brains evolved for simple, linear thinking, but today's world demands systems understanding. Specific cognitive biases block our perception of systems. Through deliberate practice, you can develop systems intelligence. This perspective transforms education, career planning, relationships, and personal growth. Common obstacles can be overcome with the right approaches. Zooming out. The truth is, systems are operating all around you, whether you perceive them or not. But learning to see and work with these systems rather than against them is perhaps the most powerful mental shift you can make. It's like putting on glasses the first time and suddenly seeing details you never knew existed. The world becomes richer, more interesting, and strangely, but more complex and more manageable. And before we end this video, I want to leave you with a quote and a little bonus to think about. We will cover this concept in one of the next videos, but you can already try and experiment with it. Write down all the inputs that you have right now in your day-to-day life. What goes into your eyes, ears, mouth, and nose? Then write your goal at the top of the page and scratch out any input behavior that does not align with your goal. And then realize that the simple reason why nothing works for you right now is because of you. You are the problem. And we want to create the character you need to become in order to achieve your goal as a byproduct of being him. And then look at his inputs. What are the daily actions, the daily behaviors that this person does that enables him to achieve this goal? And here's the quote I want you to think about until next time. Learning is self-sabotage. Learning is like sabotage because once you know what to do, you don't need to learn anything else until you do that one thing. And then you need to learn something else. How much of what we learn is actual learning, and how much is just coping and trying to avoid the pain of facing what actually needs to get done? If you want to start developing your systems intelligence today, I've created a systems thinking starter kit with practical exercises and templates for systems mapping. You can access it using the first link in the description of this video. No email opt-in or anything needed. It's free to access for you today, so go down in the description right now, click the first link and enjoy. And for those who want to go a bit deeper into the material, drop a comment below telling me which area of your life you'd most like to analyze from a systems perspective. And one last thing I want you to remember is that we all don't know anything. We say all this stuff, we study all these concepts, but at the end of the day, we're just trying to figure it out. So don't get any fake sense of pride in yourself and stay humble even when you win big. Like, subscribe, all the fun stuff. Have a nice day. Thanks you for watching. Create.